My Gavanen Melonin, and well met indeed. I am Arachir Galadirthan, head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, but welcome to another lore video. Today dealing with the fords of Isen and the battles that took place there. But before we begin, as ever, I must thank those who have continued their support of the channel, and this month I have two to thank for rising to the rank of Banner Marshal, and that my thanks therefore go to King Madman123. Thank you very much. And also to Scott Jeffs. So thank you to the both of you. And as ever, those who have continued their support of the channel, their names are listed at the end of the video. Without any further ado, let's dive in. So, dealing with the geography of the battles of the Fords of Isen first, and then we'll move on to the account of the battles. The Fords of the Isen are the chief crossing point of the Isen River, where it divides the Gap of Rohan in two. Its source is in the mountains north of Isengard, and it runs down the eastern edge of that place. And it turns westward just as it hits the White Mountains, and it eventually joins the Adorn River on the very western edge of West March, and it flows west to the sea. There are two key crossing points. The first, of course, as I've mentioned, is the fords themselves, which will feature throughout this video. But secondly, at its northern point, just as it passes Isengard, it can also be crossed in many places there. But crossing it there wasn't always the best method, because there were roads that crossed the river at the Fords of Isen. There weren't any bridges, but either side of the river there were roads, and the passing of forces or anything, literally anything that wanted to walk over the fords, it was quickest to do so at the fords, and then your onward destination west and east, it was also quicker, whereas crossing in the north meant you had to then come over a jagged country as you came down the eastern bank of the river, and it wasn't an ideal way to move a large army, which is my way of cutting you all off when you just say, why didn't Saruman just cross the river at the northern point? Why did he bother going all the way down to the fords anyway? And that is, as I say, the point. At the fords, the river is nice and wide and shallow, and it breaks into two small arms with a small hill, or eyot, at the centre. Now, eyot is a very interesting word, and I say that because it's so old and archaic that MS Word did not think it was a word. So I thought that was quite interesting. But eyot, if you haven't heard that before, it's just a small little hill in the middle of the river, essentially, and a very, very small hill. We're not talking anything grand. We're talking the space that probably maybe 10 to 20 people could possibly stand on, maybe a little more, but nothing really extreme. The river either side of this eyot was stone-based, and small stones and pebbles populated the riverbed, so it was easy to cross here. There was sure footing, the river was shallow and slow at that point, and it was just an easy way to get across. And as I say, a large army could easily cross here. Saruman thus had the cards in his favour before these battles began, because he of course could send at least some troops down both banks of the river, with the crossings in the north and the crossings at the fords, and that, as we shall see, is exactly what he does. But the fastest and safest and easiest way is across the river, and in order to get his large army across, he does need to secure the fords themselves. So I've spoken a little bit about the key players here, but for those who are not in the know, the battles of the Fords of the Isen take place immediately preceding the Battle of Helm's Deep. The Battle of Helm's Deep, if memory serves, is on the 2nd of March 3019, and the second Battle of the Fords of Isen is on the 2nd of March. I'm fairly certain. The first battle is on the 25th of February, and it's all concluded by the 2nd of March, but I may have got the dates a little wrong there. But we are talking in about a week or so before the Battle of Helm's Deep. We have these two battles at the Fords of the Isen, which are the point at which, of course, Saruman does move the army that then besieges Helm's Deep across the river. So Saruman is, of course, one of the key players, but he doesn't actually take part in the battle, as you all know. He stays in Isengard. Unfortunately, Tolkien seems to see the hordes of evil as just that, hordes, and they rarely ever get named commanders. And even in the chapter where Tolkien describes the battles of the Fords of the Isen, which is in the book Unfinished Tales, there is an entire chapter dedicated to it, and it's a good read, and it gives you a lot of interesting backstory on Rohan's military, which I won't go into here, but maybe on another video. But certainly, if you've got the book, dig out the chapter. It's only about 10 pages long, and it's a good read. But Saruman is the head of the Isengard army, even though he doesn't lead it, but there is no named warrior that does fight for Saruman's army at this point. There isn't even really leaders ascribed, which I find interesting. Whereas Rohan's army, Tolkien makes takes great strides in explaining the different effects each hero and leader has on the battle. So I find Tolkien is heavily biased towards good, I think is the point to take away from it. But Rohan's army is primarily made up of levies from the Westfold, and then some riders that come from Edoras, as we shall see later. But the Westfold garrison troops, or the Westfold sort of standing army, is what takes the brunt of the battle at the Fords of Isen. Because, as I say, I may well cover Rohan's military in another episode and video, but their military arms are broken up and they don't have command over one another, as we shall see. For Elfhelm, who is one of the key commanders of the Rohan force, comes from the muster at Edoras, and he is not, therefore, accountable to Erkenbrand, who is the sort of the leader of the Westfold forces, and it's just very interesting the way they play off one another. But the three commanders on Rohan's side are Theodred, son of the king, Grimbold, and Elfhelm, and they ably command the battles at the fords. So let us go into the history of the fords, the battles themselves then. Of course, the first battle has more information about it than the second, but the second does have at least some juicy tidbits. So the battles at the Fords of the Isen were the first full attempts at invasion by Saruman. It was vital that he secured these crossings so that he could get his large army across, because of course he intended to end Rohan once and for all. But do note, something that is helpful to know before this, is whilst the films do paint Grima and Theoden out to be this just absolutely completely twisted and contorted soul, in truth it's more like Theoden was actually just unwell and Grima aided in that state of affairs, and Grima uses his own subtle plans and planning to make sure that certain bits of information don't come to the king, and he tries to just spread disarray. So it's less that Grima is that Saruman actually controls Theoden, and it's more that Theoden is just unwell, and Grima really plays onto that. And it's suggested at the start of this chapter, actually, that Grima may well even have been poisoning the king subtly to reduce his health. So prior to this battle, Rohan is in a little bit of disarray because Grima is trying to turn Theodred and Eomer against one another, and thereby also turning them against the king himself. And he doesn't succeed in that, which is good. But Saruman is sending the army to do the final blow. He thinks Rohan is weak enough, and he can send in his almighty force and end it all. So Theodred, who is one of the chief commanders of the armies of Rohan, and particularly in the Westfold, he knows of the importance of the crossings greatly, and he bolstered the defences that Rohan had kept there. Of course, Rohan knows by now that Saruman's planning to attack them, and he's no longer an ally, but he musters his army much faster than the Rohirrim are expecting. So Theodred mans the fords on both east and west with able men from the Westfold and 3 companies of riders, along with supplies and reserve horse herds. So on the eastern banks, he has all of the main camps that his people are sort of staying in, and he has all of the reserve horse herds. So if any of the horses fall, he can get another horse, for example. And he puts 3 companies of riders on that east side as well, as a backup, as a reserve. He himself then crosses to the west bank in order to meet Saruman in the field, and he takes with him 8 companies of riders and a complement of bowmen. Now, I'm using the term companies because Tolkien directly uses that word, but he doesn't describe, certainly in this chapter, how many men is in a company. And foolishly, I didn't think to look that up. But Tolkien often describes, when he's just dealing with Rohan's forces and military, he uses the word Eored, and he uses it to mean a company of Rohirrim. And I think that's quite cool. And I'm sure somewhere he does explain how many men is in an Eored. But if you're intrigued, I'm sure you'll be able to find the answer. But for our purposes, just know that the body of Rohan's defence went to the west bank, and where most of the riders and some bowmen went. Theodred's plan was not to defend the fords, but rather meet Saruman in the field before he could attain them, thus crushing Isengard's force with Rohan's superior manoeuvrability and speed. Basically, charge Isengard out of the war before they even get into it. But it doesn't, unfortunately, go that way. So as I say, he hopes to sweep the coming army away, but Saruman has moved much quicker from Isengard than Theodred expected. And 20 miles north of the ford, Theodred meets the vanguard of Saruman's army, and he does manage to scatter this, but he takes a few losses, but not too many, and so buoyed by this success, they press on. but he finds the main camp had dug in. Saruman is no fool, and everyone and their dog knows that Rohan's entire military might is in their cavalry forces. So Saruman turns his forces to the defense, knowing that the enemy is coming. And they dig in, they build trenches, and they put pikemen behind it. So the cavalry of Rohan is totally nullified. And Theodred does still attempt to charge the enemy, and he's brought to a complete standstill in the initial charge. And he himself is almost overcome, because as the cavalry is then tied up, an extra force of orcs come from the west that Saruman had sent to loop around. But Theodred manages to pull his forces back at the arrival of support from his own horsemen. So of course Theodred is leading at the front, his horsemen are in a line. Once the back force arrives, they are able to then mount an effective retreat. So Theodred pulls his forces back, but as he turns to withdraw, he then sees on the east bank of the river a force of orcs are making their way south with great speed. Now, the Rohirrim's retreat is accomplished very easily, because the Rohirrim are actually made out to be a fantastic military force, very, very well drilled. And this is one of those examples where Tolkien specifically says that even though they're trying to retreat from pikemen who are dug in and entrenched, the cavalry gets away with minimal losses because the Rohirrim practice these things so well. And so they manage to pull away, as I say, with little loss. And Grimbold, this is where he first joins the story, because Grimbold is leading the rear guard of Theodred's column. And he, in the back, he's able to pick off the few straggling orcs and uruks that do try to pursue the enemy, or try to pursue the Rohirrim, sorry. By nightfall, Theodred has returned to the fords, and he'd beaten Isengard back to them. So he sets Grimbold on the west bank with 50 extra dismounted riders. I should state that at no point is Saruman's army size ever told. We get various points from Tolkien about what's on the good side. For example, here we know 50 dismounted riders are set onto the west bank to bolster the forces that are already there. We have things like 8 companies of riders, we have half an Eored pop up in the story later, but we never have any idea or understanding of how many orcs, uruks, orcmen or Dunlendings are in that fight, which is a bit disappointing, but there we are. So, as I say, 50 dismounted on the west with Grimbold, and Theodred sends all of the other riders onto the east bank to prepare for the coming assault. But he and one company, he dismounts and stays on the Eyot. So Theodred's plan is to aid in the retreat of Grimbold's forces should they become overwhelmed. So he sends most of his riders to the east to deal with the army coming down the river. He stays on the Eyot with a company of dismounted riders, and his plan is for Grimbold to hold the enemy as long as possible, then to withdraw to the Eyot, where they'll be refreshed and replenished by Theodred and his company, thus be able to hold Isengard still longer. And hopefully in all of this, the eastern bank will have wiped out the force coming from there, and then they can assist as well. But just as Theodred gets to the Eyot, then Saruman's eastern force arrives. So the company of riders, or the companies of riders Theodred has sent across the river, are not all across yet at the moment that Saruman's force arrives. And driving that force forward, something Theodred didn't know, are Dunlending horsemen coupled with orcish wolf riders. And the wolves of Isengard spread panic amongst the horses, and the two mounted groups come swiftly upon the horse herds first. So, and almost all of these are slain or routed. So almost all of Rohan's backup horse supply is gone at the outset of the battle proper. Behind this mounted attack, with the Dunlending horsemen and wolf riders, come the heavily armoured uruks. This is the first time they appear in the fight. Until now it's been mostly orcs. And they become upon the defenders in the east in surprise, and they easily sweep away the eastern bank's defenders. And this happens, as I say, at the same time that Theodred's horsemen are crossing back across from the east, so they can't even mount an effective charge. So this company of riders, or these companies of riders who are moving across, plus the defenders who are caught in surprise, then have to fight their way south in the end. They cannot break east, and of course the enemy's coming from the north. And if they try and break west, then they will lose the eastern bank altogether. So they retreat slowly, giving up little ground, but still retreating, and they go south. At this time, just as the eastern bank is then running and fleeing south, fighting their way away, a fierce band of men and half-orcs, or orc men is what Tolkien calls them, and it's a clear distinction between men, and orc men. So the orc men are the hybrids, whereas men are just men. And they're wielding fierce axes, is all we know, and they drive through to the Ayot and surround Theodred's company. So the army on the east, first of all, was Dunlending horsemen and orcish wolf riders. Then they were supported by heavily armoured Uruks who swept away the defenders, and then came in the sort of heavy flank troops, or strike troops, that had one sole purpose, as we learn from the chapter as well, and their purpose is to kill Theodred. Before all of this battle takes place, Saruman knows that Grima's attempts to make Eomer, Theodred and Theoden all hate each other have failed, and that Theodred and Eomer, the bond between them is fierce and strong. And Theodred is easily the biggest roadblock to Saruman's victory in Rohan. He's a well-liked and loved individual within Rohan. He has the ear of the king, and he and Eomer have no hatred between them at all. And they're the two main captains or main leaders of Rohan's forces. And Theodred also happens to be a damned good military leader, and Saruman needs him dead. So this is the purpose of these orc men with these axes. They drive straight to the Ayot and they surround Theodred's company. Just as they do, Saruman's western force arrives, and Grimbold is then attacked on that side. The situation turns very dire. Theodred's men are hard-pressed to hold back the coming tide, and they retreat to the centre of this small isle, where Theodred then cries out at the top of his lungs, "To me, Eolengas!" Grimbold immediately hears this and answers. He takes a handful of men with him and he charges back into the river to join with Theodred's company. He comes upon the rear of this eastern orcish army and takes them by surprise, but that doesn't take anything away from him personally, for Grimbold fights absolutely savagely, and he is able to cut right through to Theodred just as the son of the king takes a fierce and, as it proves, fatal blow from a great orc man. Again, a nameless orc man. Grimbold is able to slay this assailant, and he readies himself mentally to die alongside Theodred, for all seems lost. But it was not to be so, because Elfhelm had come. So Elfhelm was leading 4 companies of horsemen from Edoras itself, and he was coming to answer the summons of Theodred that he'd sent out some days earlier before the battle began. For Theodred really did know, and anyone knows, because the Isen is between Isengard and Rohan, that if they can hold the Isen, Saruman will not gain any ground. So he tries to pull all the troops he can to the fords of the Isen where possible, and Elfhelm is the answering call from Edoras with 4 companies of horsemen. Elfhelm had originally intended to camp in Helm's Deep and come to the fords in the morning, but on his way from the east he had reports of wolf riders that were roaming in the Westfold, and he thought, oh hang on, that does not sound good. So he presses on to the fords despite his company's tiredness and how long they've been running. And he is able to come upon the Isengarders and catch them completely unawares on the eastern bank. The charge of the Rohirrim under Elfhelm is absolutely devastating, and he comes out of the night, it said, like phantoms. The orcs couldn't see the charge until the last moment, but they could hear the thunderous sound of countless hooves bearing down on them from the darkness. It would have been terrifying for the orcs. Elfhelm, despite his relatively small number of horsemen, is able to totally scatter the forces on the eastern bank in a single charge, and 2 of his companies are then diverted to the north to chase down any who flee. So the eastern bank is secured. However, he doesn't see the retreating force that had pressed to the south, as I mentioned earlier, and they continue fighting the orcs that are fighting them in that direction. So Elfhelm is not able to save those who were pressed south, nor is he able to fight the Uruks that followed them. But he does secure the eastern bank, certainly at the crossing point. The companies that he doesn't send north, he then charges onto the Ayot with, and the orc men there fighting around Theodred's dead or dying body, and Grimbold's still alive body, are then totally surrounded and outnumbered by the number of Rohirrim who have arrived. So the orcs' men morale is now very low, and they are slain to a man. But not before Elfhelm could reach Grimbold. So in the midst of the battle, as these orc men are getting basically cut down mercilessly, Elfhelm is able to reach Grimbold in the centre, and he finds the latter fighting over 2 tall orc men who are trying to get possession of Theodred's body to take it back to Saruman. Together, Grimbold and Elfhelm are able to slay the foes, and they stoop to pick Theodred up. But he still has just enough life, and his last words are as follows: Let me lie here to keep the fords until Eomer comes. And it is then at that point that Theodred passes away. Now, interestingly, in this side note, in this chapter and at this point, it doesn't say what happens to Theodred's body at all. We know, of course, that it does go back to Edras and it's entombed and buried, whatever. But it never mentions Theodred's body again. So after he actually dies in the middle of the Aya, it doesn't even mention them bearing his body away. That he's just cut from the story at this point, which I thought was quite interesting. But as I've already mentioned, him mentioning Eomer is because of the very, very tight bond that grows between them. So, because Eomer, of course, was the son of Eamund and Theodwyn, which is Theoden's sister, and he and Eowyn were orphaned when he was 11. Their father dies in an orcish attack, and their mother dies naturally soon after. It's implied in the same year. So he's taken in by Theoden and grew up alongside Theodred. Theodred was 13 years Eomer's senior, but the love between them is incredibly strong, and they are as brothers. It's also mentioned that Eomer is not ambitious, so he has no plans to sort of usurp Theodred or become Theoden's favoured son or anything like that. So they have like an idyllic relationship, and the two of them are really the driving force in Rohan's defence. Whereas Theoden, of course, Theodred, in the film, Theodred is very much passed over, and if you don't watch the extended edition, he's nothing more than a cadaver, who Eowyn spends some time looking over, and then they have his funeral. Whereas, at least in the extended edition, you kind of see him fight for a bit. Whereas Eomer is given a lot of attention, of course, but certainly the book version of Theodred and Eomer are far more interesting and heroic than, I would say, the film versions. So returning to the battle then, they've managed to get to Theodred's body, but the West Bank is still assailed by the Isengarders until sometime in the middle of the night, a great harsh horn is blown, and the orcs' attack dissipates. The enemy just disappears into the night, and they retreat utterly. Rohan is therefore able to win the first battle of the Fords of the Isen, but they pay dearly. Not only is there great loss in life of soldiers, but Theodred, the king's only son, perishes as well. So they're now leaderless. But as morning came, men soon began to return, including those from the south, who said that they'd been pressed into a defensive position, and they'd prepared to make their final stand until this horn blast sounded, and the Uruks just vanished. They were able to then press back to the north, although they moved very slowly, expecting an attack to come, and it just never did. They also said that they expected the fords to have been lost, and that their coming to the fords would have been a sort of heroic last attack, if you will. But so they were surprised to find it still held by Rohan. Also, men and horses who had been scattered in the east slowly come back as well, so the defences at the Isen are bolstered slightly. Erkenbrand thereafter, in a few days afterwards, assumes command of the Westmark in its totality, and he sends some riders to convey Theodred's last words back to Edoras and to ask for Eomer to be sent west with more troops. But this is where Grima comes into the story, because he uses his cunning, well, not really cunning, but just he very easily delays this message, and it doesn't reach Theoden. Eomer's forces would not be sent. Erkenbrand gives control of the field to Grimbold, so he has command on the ground, but, as I've already mentioned, the way that the different marshals of the Mark and the different musterings of Rohan work, because Elfhelm was from the muster of Edoras, and Grimbold is from the muster of the Westmark, they have no power over one another, so Grimbold can't command Elfhelm's forces, and likewise the other way around. But the two of them do work together well, it is said, though, and they take up a joint command of the fords. But they do disagree in how to actually defend the fords, and they divide their forces. But Tolkien very much implies that even if they didn't divide their forces, the battle would still go ill. Spoiler alert, I suppose, but of course you know it does. That's why the Battle of Helm's Deep takes place. So they split their forces in line with their thinking. Elfhelm, at this point, thinks the fords are totally unworthy of defence. He doesn't think there's any point losing men here, because Isengard can come down the east bank anyway. So both the east and west banks the forces of Isengard can come. We could get trapped in the centre with no way of retreat, and certainly all die and lose the fords anyway. So he pulls his forces away to the east, and he leaves a large sway of open ground between him and the fields on the east bank of the river, with his plan being to charge the Isengarders into the river and to their death, to use Rohan's cavalry advantage to shut down any attempt Isengard makes at coming down the east bank. Grimbold disagrees, and he sets up on the west bank with many footmen, and he takes to the defence on both sides of the river. So even though he takes to the west bank, he does put men on both east and west. So Elfhelm completely withdraws from the fords and hopes to use the gap between him and the river as a charging ground. Grimbold thinks we should set up defensive positions. And on the west bank of the river, there are two great forts that the Rohirrim use to defend the road as it passes through. And this is where Grimbold sets his chief defence. He leaves the eye at Bear, though. He doesn't want any men on the isle in the middle. So Saruman begins his attack in the morning of the 2nd of March. It was the 2nd of March, I thought I'd written it down. His best fighters come down the west bank and they start fighting in the earthen forts that I just mentioned. Saruman only sends what he deems necessary to defeat the beleaguered defenders, but Rohan proves a stubborn take and they fight very valiantly. In time, however, Isengard's numbers do get the better of them, and a gap is made between the two forts where the enemy can push through. So Grimbold then chooses this moment to push across the river with support from the eastern side and aid the forts. And they're able to disrupt the enemy for a while, but then further enemy forces arrive and the defenders are all beaten back to the east bank by nightfall. So after a day of fighting in the forts on the west bank, all of the Rohirric forces are pushed to the east bank, so the west is lost utterly. The Rohirrim do suffer in this fight, but the Isengarders suffer far more, and they take many, many more casualties. But as I say, Elfhelm had pulled his men in to support on the east bank further back, and they set up a screen to the north to try and keep warning of any troops that may come from the northern side and give them advance warning so that they can do their charge. And the defenders now very much are of the opinion that unless support can come from Edoras or from Erkenbrand, then they are going to die here. And Grimbold has set up on the bank of the river at this point, and Elfhelm awaits in the darkness away to the east. And they sit and they wait. And at midnight, the attack finally comes. So the bulk of the enemy force comes down the east bank, and they were said to appear as a river of fire from the number of their torches. They come down the west bank, which is now clear. They sweep across the river, and Grimbold sees immediately it is not worth trying to defend the actual river bank itself. And so he pulls back into a shield wall and sets up in a camp a short way from the river. His shield wall is strong and fierce, and the orcs cannot break it, despite their numbers. They began throwing their torches at the defenders and even high over them to try and set fire to the camp behind the shield wall, but it just doesn't work and the defenders hold. The orcs then decide to throw the men of Dunland into the fight, because the men of Dunland, of course, absolutely hate the Rohirrim. They have a very checkered history, going a long way back, and they are bloodthirsty for the death of these usurpers, these land stealers, poachers, if you will. But for all of their hatred and savagery, the Dunlendings are actually no match for the organised and well-drilled military might of Rohan. It is like peasants with pitchforks up against knights in shining armour. It's no challenge. And so the shield wall, again, still holds. Grimbold at this point is really hoping that Elfhelm will now finally charge in and assist, but after a time he realises that no help is coming. Something has happened. And he decides that it would not help Erkenbrand or the greater Rohirric cause if he and his men die here. No matter how valorous their fall might be, their deaths are not going to save Rohan, and he needs to try and get as many people out as possible. So he breaks open the shield wall to the south so that he can get some men out and bolster the main Westfold army that is camped in Helm's Deep. Just try and get men there. He mounts as many men as he can, and under the command of a man called Dunhir, they half an Eored's worth of men, as it said. And again, I apologise, I didn't look up how much many men an Eored is, but half an Eored worth of men break out of the shield wall, which I assume at this point is circular, and they charge out to the east. Before breaking away completely, they charge back into the enemy, who are now almost completely surrounding the Rohirrim, and they gain quite a bit of success in causing confusion amongst the enemy. Grimbold uses this confusion to then order most of his footmen to also retreat under the cover of darkness. So the front of the shield wall holds, and as many men as possible in the back, along with this mounted contingent, are able to break out into the night and escape. Grimbold is amongst them. He does not die here. Now, as I say, he had hoped Elfhelm would come, and no help did come, and that is because Elfhelm himself had been attacked by over half of Saruman's force. So Elfhelm had the better of it in the end, in terms of understanding, because Saruman did split his army and send half down one side and half down the other, just as Elfhelm had thought he might. And the force that comes upon Elfhelm is, of course, made primarily of wolf riders, and they block the gap between Elfhelm and Grimbold. So the riders that he had taken to the east are then trapped themselves in melee combat with wolf riders and ground forces running up behind. All Elfhelm is able to do is retreat to the east lest he take too many losses, and this he does. So unbeknownst to Grimbold, when Grimbold is planning his great escape, Elfhelm's forces had already gone. They are completely out of the battlefield, and they're scampering off into the lands of the Westfold to try and stay alive. And so, with Grimbold's forces dead or retreating and Elfhelm's off into the night, the second battle of the Fords of Isen, is a loss, and Isengard is able to flood into the Westfold. But it is not for them to then rampage and pillage, for the Battle of Helm's Deep takes place not very long after. Indeed, I believe it is the next day or 2 days after, or something along those lines. It's very, very near, anyway. Because Gandalf then comes upon both Grimbold and Elfhelm after they were able to gather most of their retreated forces in the day of the following. I'm fairly certain it is the following day. I'm pretty sure Helm's Deep takes place on the 3rd of March. Yeah, but it might be the 4th. And anyway, Gandalf comes upon both Grimbold and Elfhelm. And Grimbold's footmen are taken by Gandalf, and they are then used in the coming battle of Helm's Deep to finally beat the Uruks, as we talked about in the last video. The story of the Fords ends there, but not Elfhelm's or Grimbold's. For the two great defenders of Rohan, Elfhelm was given charge of the first Theodred of the East Mark, and he was one of the leading commanders at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. I believe Elfhelm is given the task of taking his riders east, or it's west, sorry, because they come from the north, don't they? And his riders skirt round the wall of Minas Tirith itself, I believe, the first wall, I think, anyway. Well, that's in the back of my mind. I'm mustering that image. So he gets given command of the first Theodred of one of the major marshals of the Mark, or major armies of Rohan, for want of a much better word, but you get the idea. He survives the wars of the Third Age completely, and he is a chief witness at the coronation of King Elisar. So Elfhelm survives out his days and then lives in peace, one would assume, in Rohan. For Grimbold, the tale is a little grim, if you'll pardon the pun. He also marches to Minas Tirith, and he is given command of the muster of the Westfold, because Erkenbrand is a very old man by this time, and Theoden feels that he perhaps is not best suited to leading an army in what will be the battle of all battles for these people. And Grimbold is therefore given command of the Westfold forces in Erkenbrand's stead, which is a mighty honour. Erkenbrand himself was left behind to defend Rohan during the battles at Minas Tirith and the Black Gate. Grimbold, although we don't really know how, but he falls in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields at some point, and so his body is taken back to Rohan, unfortunately lifeless. And that is the end of the battles of the Fords of the Isen. Oh, I keep saying that, Fords of Isen. It's such an interesting chapter, I think, in Unfinished Tales, because Tolkien is very, very reluctant to talk about actual battles. And so to dedicate an entire extra chapter, of course, Tolkien himself didn't directly write Unfinished Tales. Christopher Tolkien gathered these stories from writings his father had made and turned them into a at least somewhat presentable book. So it maybe was never Tolkien's intention for this story to ever really see the light, but it's one of those rare moments where Tolkien devotes his entire imagination and writing prowess to a story just about a battle. It's very, very rare. You may even know that of all the many chapters in The Lord of the Rings, all 6 books, the Battle of Helm's Deep is a single chapter, and even then, the actual battle itself is over only a few pages. He's really reluctant to talk about battles, I personally think. Other opinions, of course, may be there, but from my reading, it's rare. So this is such an interesting look. And as I say, I probably will cover perhaps the military of Rohan. It might have been an idea to do it in this video, but I didn't think about it until just now. And it's a little late. But if you've got Unfinished Tales, definitely read the chapter of the Battles of the Isen, because the military lineup of Rohan is all explained there, and it's very interesting. But for now, that is going to conclude this episode. So thank you very much for watching, if indeed you have. If you do like these lore stories and lore videos, then I would encourage you to watch the Nazgul video that was published only 2 days ago. It is entirely non-canonical, and it is made up, which I did stress in the video, but some people seem to have missed that. But I would suggest you give that a listen if you're interested. We've created our own backstory for the Nazgul, because they don't have one. And in Divide and Conquer we have the freedom to do as we want, really. So we've given them some backstory. And I'd welcome your thought on that story. There will be 7 of those videos in total, but we will not write stories for Kamul or for the Witch King. But until we speak again, dear friends, thank you to all of you for listening, and to all those who still support the channel. But until then, Nevair Naden Perimad Melunin, and farewell.